On the evening of 22nd December 1930, in the ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in New York, a young woman in pale satin pauses before she signs the first of hundreds of engraved cards. Outside, the Great Depression lines the streets with hardship. Inside, 3,000 guests, two orchestras, and Maurice Chevalier in a Santa costume wait for the signal that the poor little rich girl's ball may begin. Society columns would later call it the night Bobby became Barbara Hutton, debutante, glamour queen, playgirl of the Western world. She slips off one glove, smooths the paper, and begins the ritual she has been drilled to perform since childhood. The gracious note, the perfect signature, the careful gratitude that keeps a world in balance. Each card is etiquette, but also insurance. Somewhere between the glittering jewels given to every guest and the headlines condemning the extravagance, a quieter record is kept. Not in the newspapers, but at the private cost of a girl learning that love, in her world, is always itemized. The pen moves, the music starts. The price of that evening will be paid for the rest of her life. On 3rd May 1917, in a suite at the Plaza Hotel in New York, 4-year-old Barbara Hutton is led away as doctors pronounce her mother, Edna Woolworth Hutton, dead from suffocation due to mastoiditis. The New York Times reports the death of Mrs. Hutton, daughter of F.W. Woolworth, with no mention of the child who reportedly found the body. The image is preserved in family correspondence and later biographical accounts. A small girl in white cotton, standing at a doorway, watching adults move with urgent purpose through rooms that smell of camphor and roses. In the days that follow, letters pass between relatives and lawyers as her father, stockbroker Franklin Laws Hutton, withdraws further into work and what contemporaries would describe as emotional unavailability. The language of these letters, later quoted in C. David Heyman's biography, is formal, concerned with logistics rather than grief. The child will be sent to arrangements have been made for. It is thought best that Barbara. The passive voice predominates. No one asks what Barbara herself might need or want. Biographers describe her being shuttled among relatives, from her maternal grandmother Jenny Woolworth to various aunts, raised largely by a governess rather than a parent, more at home with servants than with other children. Tiki Toke, her French governess, becomes the most stable presence in a world of transient authority figures. The Plaza Suite is packed up. Barbara's possessions, her dolls, her books, her mother's jewelry, are inventoried and stored. The first lessons she receives are not Latin or piano, but the unspoken rule that grief is to be handled off stage, in private, away from public view. One can imagine the child watching condolence notes being drafted on heavy stationery, her name mentioned but not addressed. The world has already decided that her story will be told in financial columns rather than in diaries. In the months after her mother's death, she is photographed rarely, and when she is, her face shows the careful blankness of a child learning to hide. The camera captures a small figure, in expensive clothes, standing very still, as if movement might break something. The routine that emerges is structured around absence. Her father visits on weekends, sometimes. Her grandmother oversees her wardrobe and her health with the attention one might give to a valuable possession. Tiki Toke manages the days. Lessons in French, walks in Central Park under watchful eyes, afternoons practicing penmanship and thank you notes for gifts Barbara has not asked for and does not particularly want. At night, in a bedroom larger than most New York apartments, she learns to fall asleep alone. By the time she is 6, she has been taught that love, if it exists at all, expresses itself through provision rather than presence. The servants are kind but professional. Her relatives are dutiful but distant. Her father is a name on checks and occasional telegrams. The architecture of her life, the high-ceilinged rooms, the imported furniture, the governesses who come and go, teaches her that security is a matter of money and management, not affection. Before she learns to write her own letters, her life has already been reduced to a line in an estate file. By late May 1924, in a New York law office off Wall Street, the will of Jenny Creighton Woolworth was read. 12-year-old Barbara, now living between relatives and governesses in a brownstone on East 80th Street, becomes heiress to $26,100,000 with an additional $2,100,000 in stock placed in a separate trust. These are sums that her father, through careful management and the rising stock market of the 1920s, will grow to roughly $42 million by her 21st birthday in 1933, not counting another $8 million from her mother's estate. Financial writers later calculate that this $1 million baby inheritance would approach a modern billion when adjusted for inflation and market growth. In letters and memoranda preserved in family archives and later quoted in multiple biographies, bankers note her future as a principal beneficiary and discuss the challenges of managing what is, effectively, a personal fortune, larger than the operating budgets of many American cities. In family correspondence, she is equally abstract. Barbara's share, Barbara's portion, the girl's inheritance. The human being at the center of these calculations is rarely addressed directly. At home on East 80th Street, a governess supervises her handwriting exercises and the first polite notes of thanks for birthday gifts and holiday remembrances. Barbara's hand is neat, her letters carefully formed. The content is formulaic. Thank you so much for your kind gift. I shall treasure it always. With warmest regards. She signs her name hundreds of times, practicing the signature that will, in a few years, appear on checks and contracts worth millions. Somewhere behind the grammar drills and the deportment lessons lies a message that becomes clearer as she grows older. A butler, in an account later repeated to Haman, reportedly puts it into blunt words when Barbara is 9. Someday she may be the richest girl in the world, but all that means is that somebody will want to marry you for your money. The remark is meant, perhaps, as a warning, a piece of servant-class wisdom offered to a girl who will never experience servant-class anonymity. Barbara does not forget it. The brownstone on East 80th Street is comfortable, elegant, filled with the material markers of wealth. Persian rugs, oil paintings, fresh flowers delivered daily, a music room where a piano instructor comes 3 times a week, but it is not, in any meaningful sense, a home. Barbara's father maintains his own residence and his own social calendar. Her grandmother, until her death, visits to inspect and advise. Aunts and cousins appear for holidays. Barbara herself moves through the rooms like a guest, polite and self-contained, observing rituals whose meaning is never quite explained. In school photographs from this period, she attends Miss Hewitt's classes, a private institution for daughters of New York's elite. She appears composed, well-dressed, expressionless. Her classmates in later interviews remember her as quiet, generous with gifts, sometimes lonely. One contemporary recalls that Barbara would offer to buy things for other girls, not out of arrogance but out of a desire to be liked, as if friendship were another transaction that could be managed with sufficient funds. The pattern is already forming: money as a substitute for connection, generosity as a plea for acceptance. By adolescence, the terms of her life are clear. She will be wealthy beyond measure. She will be watched, assessed, pursued. She will never be certain whether affection is genuine or instrumental. The trust that holds her fortune is, in a sense, the most honest relationship she has. It protects her assets while limiting her freedom, and it makes no pretense of love. Before she has any say in her future, that future is already collateral. In the summer of 1929, at Newport, Rhode Island, the teenage Barbara moved between shingled cottages and marble palaces, from Bailey's Beach to borrowed verandas. This is the final, blazing summer of the old order, though no one quite knows it yet. The stock market climbs. The parties grow larger. The sense of permanence is, in retrospect, an illusion, but in the moment it feels as solid as the limestone facades along Bellevue Avenue. Contemporary accounts place Barbara here with fellow heiress Doris Duke, daughter of tobacco magnate James Buchanan Duke. The press, delighting in symmetry and alliteration, dubs them part of a small sorority of poor little rich girls, and in one phrase that sticks, the Gold Dust Twins of New York wealth. The nickname is meant to be charming. It is also a form of labeling, a way of making these young women interchangeable, their individual personalities subsumed into their financial identities. Days at Newport are structured with the precision of a military campaign. Mornings begin with tutors, French literature, German grammar, European history, mathematics, sufficient for managing household accounts, but not generally for professional application. Afternoons are spent under watchful eyes at Bailey's Beach, the exclusive enclave where membership is inherited and outsiders are politely but firmly excluded. Barbara and Doris, both in their mid-teens, swim in the cold Atlantic, their movements observed by chaperones and older women who assess posture, deportment, and social ease with the practiced eyes of connoisseurs. Evenings unfold in drawing rooms where the older generation, Mrs. Astor, Mrs. Vanderbilt, Mrs. Belmont, hold court. Barbara learns to enter a room, to accept a chair, to manage the small talk that oils the machinery of high society. She learns which topics are acceptable, the arts, travel, fashion, charitable work, and which are not, politics, money, personal ambition, intellectual debate. She learns to smile without revealing too much, to listen without forming strong opinions, to be decorative without being conspicuous. The social season itself functions as an educational institution, perhaps the most important one these young women will attend. Invitations and omissions serve as report cards. To be invited to certain dinners, certain dances, certain weekend house parties is to be certified as suitable. To be excluded is to be marked as deficient, whether in beauty, manners, family connections, or the indefinable quality called breeding. Barbara, with her fortune and her family name, is invited everywhere. Yet the invitations themselves carry a burden. She is always on display, always being evaluated, never simply present. Society columns from Newport and New York treat these girls as living investments. Their progress toward suitable marriages tracked with the attention that financial pages devote to stock performance. Miss Hutton attended, Miss Duke was seen. The language is one of perpetual observation. F. Scott Fitzgerald, writing years later to his own daughter, would warn that the system that produced Barbara Hutton was unsustainable, a house of cards built on inherited wealth and social exclusion that the Depression and the wars to come would sweep away. But in the summer of 1929, the system appeared eternal. At night, Barbara practices the small rituals that will soon be public performance, rising gracefully from a low chair without using her hands, accepting a dance card with the correct degree of please surprise, and beginning a thank you note with the proper salutation and tone. Tiki Toke. Still, her governess oversees these rehearsals. The world beyond Newport appears limitless. Europe, with its titled aristocracy and ancient estates. New York, with its opera premieres and charity galas. California, newly fashionable among the very rich. Yet every path runs between the same marble balustrades. Every option leads back to the same essential transaction. Beauty and money exchanged for social position and, if possible, affection. In a photograph from that summer, Barbara stands on a Newport lawn, wearing white linen. Her hair caught in the sea breeze. She is smiling, or appears to be. The smile is well practiced, charming, impossible to read. Behind her, the Atlantic stretches toward Europe, where other young women in other grand houses are preparing for the same rituals, the same marriages, the same careful erasure of the self in service of family strategy. On the eve of the crash, her life already moves to a rhythm set by other people's ledgers. By Barbara's adolescence, the pattern is well established and historically documented. For more than half a century, wealthy American heiresses have crossed the Atlantic to marry impoverished European aristocrats, trading cash for titles in what historians and contemporary observers call the era of the dollar princess. Between 1870 and 1914, at least 100 British aristocrats, including 9 dukes, married American women, their crumbling estates kept afloat by American industrial and commercial fortunes. The transactions are rarely hidden. Dowries are negotiated like business contracts, with lawyers representing both families. Settlements specify exactly how much money will transfer, in what form, and under what conditions. The American bride brings capital. The European groom brings a title, a coat of arms, access to court, and the patina of ancient lineage. Both sides understand the terms. Both sides generally consider it a fair exchange. Barbara does not need a title to be useful to the system. She is herself a concentrated form of capital, more liquid and more portable than most. Schools like Miss Hewitt's and Miss Porter's, summer colonies like Newport, debutante circuits in New York and London, all exist partly to refine young women like her and partly to place them. The education is real. These young women often speak multiple languages fluently, understand European history and art, and can manage complex social situations with grace. But education is also instrumental. It produces women who can move easily in international society, who can represent American wealth without embarrassing it, who can be admired without being threatening. This is the architecture of privilege into which Barbara is carefully fitted. It is beautiful in its way. It is also a cage whose bars are made of etiquette and expectation rather than iron. By 1928, in classrooms at Miss Hewitt's classes on New York's Upper East Side and later at Miss Porter's school in Farmington, Connecticut, Barbara moves through a curriculum that mixes serious academics, French, German, mathematics, history, literature, with music, art, and the deportment suitable for future society hostesses. The schools are not merely finishing institutions. They provide genuine intellectual training, but they also provide something else: initiation into a world where intelligence must be deployed carefully, never in ways that threaten male authority or social hierarchy. Miss Porter's school, founded in 1843, has by the 1920s established itself as the premier finishing school for daughters of America's elite. Archival material on the school's 19th and early 20th century curriculum notes Latin, modern languages, music, natural sciences, and mathematics. The aim was not simply ornament, but the creation of disciplined, self-controlled young women who could move confidently in drawing rooms, diplomatic salons, and the complex social world of international high society. Graduates are expected to manage large households, supervise staff, host elaborate dinners, and support their husbands' careers without pursuing conspicuous ambitions of their own. In a dormitory study hall, late in the evening, Barbara bends over pale stationery, copying out model phrases for letters of thanks under the supervision of a teacher. "I am most grateful for your kindness. It was exceedingly generous of you to remember. I shall treasure your thoughtfulness always." The phrases are graceful, formal, calculated to please without revealing personality. The act of writing them, over and over, is a form of training in self-erasure. What Barbara thinks, what Barbara wants, what Barbara feels, these are irrelevant to the task at hand, which is to produce the correct social response, the note that maintains connection without demanding reciprocity. The gesture is outwardly gentle, the pens are expensive, the paper thick and cream-colored, the wax seals elegant, but the underlying lesson is clear. Barbara's handwriting is not only a reflection of character, but a tool of social survival. A badly written note, an incorrect salutation, a tone that is too familiar or too cold. Any of these can damage a relationship, close a door, and mark her as deficient. In a world where women's power is exercised through influence rather than authority, the ability to write the perfect letter is not a minor accomplishment. It is a form of currency. At Miss Porter's, Barbara also studies French literature, German philosophy, English history. She reads Racine and Goethe in the original languages. She learns to play Chopin on the piano with technical proficiency, if not particular passion. She paints watercolors of flowers and landscapes, acceptable subjects for a young woman's artistic expression. She is, by any objective measure, well educated. Yet the education is always in service of something else: the production of a marriageable woman, charming but not intellectual, accomplished but not ambitious, decorative but not challenging. Her classmates, in later memoirs and interviews, remember her as generous, often sad, occasionally disappearing into private silences. One contemporary recalls Barbara sitting by a window in the dormitory, writing letters that she would later tear up rather than send. Another remembers her giving away jewelry, small pieces, pearls, gold bracelets, to girls she wanted to befriend, as if affection could be purchased with gifts. The pattern established in childhood persists. Barbara understands wealth, understands transaction, but struggles to navigate the murkier territory of genuine connection. In the spring of 1930, Barbara graduated from Miss Porter's. The yearbook photograph shows a poised young woman in pearls, her expression carefully neutral. The caption notes her family name, her accomplishments in French and music, her expected debut in New York society the following winter. It does not mention that she has already learned the central lesson of her education, that she is valuable not for who she is, but for what she represents. A fortune, a name, a glittering prize in a marriage market that treats women as assets to be acquired and managed. Long before she signs marriage contracts, she is drilled in how to sign her name to gratitude. On the night of 22nd December 1930, the ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in New York glitters with crystal chandeliers, white orchids flown in from California, and thousands of candles that cast a warm, expensive glow over everything they touch. Guests from the Astor, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and Morgan families arrive in furs and diamonds to be greeted by Maurice Chevalier, the French entertainer, dressed in a Santa Claus costume. Each guest receives a small jewel case containing unmounted gems, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, party favors that cost more than most Americans will earn in a year. The debutante ball, with a final price tag estimated at $60,000, takes place at the depths of the Great Depression, less than 18 months after the stock market crash that has devastated the American economy. Outside the Ritz-Carlton, bread lines stretch down city blocks. Inside, 2 orchestras play, champagne flows, and 1,000 guests dine on dishes prepared by the hotel's French chefs. The contrast is not lost on anyone, least of all the press. The next morning, newspapers across the country explode with outrage. Nero fiddled while Rome burned, one editorial begins, and Barbara Hutton danced. The New York Times runs the story on the front page. Tabloids dub her the poor little rich girl, a nickname that will follow her for the rest of her life. The phrase is meant ironically, an accusation disguised as sympathy. How dare this girl, this heiress, flaunt her wealth while ordinary Americans struggle to feed their families? Barbara herself, at 18, sits at a desk in her father's house the next morning, still in her dressing gown, facing hundreds of thank you cards that must be written by hand. This is the ritual that follows every significant social event, the gracious acknowledgement, the perfect expression of gratitude, the careful maintenance of relationships. Her hand moves across the cards with practiced ease. Thank you so much for joining me. Your presence meant so much. I am grateful for your kindness. The phrases are sincere in form, if not always in feeling. She signs her name over and over, the signature she has been practicing since childhood. Later accounts, drawing on conversations with people who knew her, suggest that Barbara was horrified by the public reaction to the ball. She had not chosen the extravagance. Her father and his social advisors had planned the event, determined to launch her into society with appropriate grandeur. Barbara herself, according to these accounts, would have preferred something smaller, quieter, less conspicuous. But she had been raised to comply, to perform, to do what was expected. And what was expected was a debut befitting the Woolworth heiress. The criticism wounds her deeply. In private letters quoted in later biographies, she writes of feeling misunderstood, judged for circumstances beyond her control. I did not ask to be born rich, she writes to a friend. I did not choose this life. Yet the world sees only the surface, the diamonds, the champagne, the careless luxury. No one asks what it costs to be the poor little rich girl, to be blamed for an inheritance she did nothing to earn and cannot easily escape. The publicity marks a turning point. Before the ball, Barbara was simply another heiress, wealthy and privileged, but not particularly notorious. After the ball, she becomes a symbol of excess, of inequality, of a social class divorced from the struggles of ordinary people. The nickname Poor Little Rich Girl captures something true. There is a cost to her privilege, a loneliness and vulnerability that money cannot solve. But the nickname is also a weapon. used to mock and diminish her, to suggest that her suffering, real as it may be, is trivial compared to the suffering of those who lack her advantages. In the photograph taken that night, Barbara stands in her pale satin gown, a diamond tiara in her hair, smiling for the camera. She looks like a fairy tale princess. She looks happy. Only the people closest to her know that she has already learned to perform happiness, to present the face the world expects while keeping her actual feelings hidden and safe. The world sees diamonds. The archive records something else. A girl instructed to apologize, on paper, for the size of her own existence. By spring 1931, Barbara had been sent to Europe for a rest, effectively exiled from hostile New York public opinion. Passenger lists and society pages track her movements. The Ritz in Paris, Claridge's in London, the Carlton in Cannes, the Grand Hotel in Rome. She travels with an entourage, Tiki Toke, her governess, a lady's maid, occasionally a cousin or family friend deputized to serve as chaperone. She is 17 years old and has never traveled alone. Europe in 1931 offers a refuge for wealthy Americans seeking to escape Depression-era scrutiny and resentment. The expatriate community in Paris includes writers, artists, socialites, and aristocrats, all living in a bubble of privilege that feels increasingly fragile. Barbara moves through this world with the careful courtesy she has been taught, attending embassy receptions, visiting museums, being photographed at fashionable restaurants and theaters. She is always beautifully dressed, always polite, always available for the social performance expected of her. Here she moves through a different kind of classroom, hotel lobbies where alliances are formed over tea, embassy receptions where ambitious young men assess her fortune, afternoons in couture salons where Chanel and Schiaparelli dress her like a doll. Swiss and French finishing schools during this period marketed themselves as substitutes for university, places where wealthy Western European and American women mastered table manners, conversation, languages, and international etiquette and protocol, instead of pursuing academic degrees or professional training. Though Barbara has already completed her formal education at Miss Porter's, Europe itself functions as a finishing school, teaching her to navigate a more complex social world. She learns to distinguish between genuine aristocrats and confident men claiming titles they do not possess. She learns to deflect unwanted romantic attention without causing offense. She learns that her wealth makes her visible, admired, and vulnerable in equal measure. Her letters home, quoted in later biographies and preserved in family archives, are often brief, polite, restrained. Paris is lovely. The weather has been fine. I attended a reception at the embassy. They fulfill their function, they maintain connection, they rarely reveal loneliness or fear. Reading them decades later, one senses a young woman performing dutifulness, giving her father and her family what they expect while keeping her actual experience hidden. In the eyes of European society, Barbara is not a girl still recovering from childhood trauma. The death of her mother, the emotional absence of her father, the burden of premature wealth, but a portable fortune, a walking bank account wrapped in silk and pearls. Young men, some with titles, some without, circle her with increasing boldness. Mothers of impoverished aristocrats assess her with the calculating eyes of women who understand that their family estates survive only through strategic marriages. Barbara is courted, flattered, pursued. She is also, increasingly, aware that none of this attention is actually directed at her, the person. It is directed at her money. In Paris, she sits for a portrait by a fashionable artist. In London, she orders gowns from Norman Hartnell, dressmaker to the British royal family. In Cannes, she attends parties on yachts owned by European nobility and American millionaires. Life appears glamorous, enviable. In private, in letters she writes but does not always send, Barbara confesses to loneliness, to a sense of being always on stage, never able to relax into genuine feeling or connection. One evening in Monte Carlo, at a casino where she has been taken by a group of new acquaintances, Barbara loses several $1,000s at the baccarat table. The loss means nothing to her financially. It is pocket change, but the experience unsettles her. She watches the other players, their faces tense with real stakes, real consequences. For them, gambling is dangerous, exciting, potentially ruinous. For her, it is simply another form of entertainment, another way to pass the time. The distance between her experience and theirs underscores her isolation. By the time she returned to New York in late 1931, Barbara had acquired Polish, sophistication, fluency in French, and adequate Italian. She has also acquired a wary awareness that her wealth is both her protection and her prison. The farther she travels, the more completely her education in elegance becomes indistinguishable from training in how to be desired for the balance sheet attached to her name. On 22nd June 1933, in a Russian Orthodox church in Paris, Barbara married Prince Alexis Mdivani, a Georgian nobleman whose family has become notorious in the international press as the marrying Mdivanis for their strategic alliances with wealthy American and European women. Alexis's brother, Sergei, has previously married and divorced silent film star Pola Negri and is now married to opera singer Mary McCormick. Another brother, David, was briefly married to Mae Murray, a Hollywood actress. The sisters, Rusi and Nina, have also married into wealth. The pattern is well established and widely known. The Mdivanis trade charm, titles, and exotic continental glamour for American money. Biographer C. David Heyman describes how Alexis's sister helped engineer the match, pressuring Barbara after a staged compromise in San Sebastian, Spain. The details are murky, the accounts contradictory, but the outline is clear. Barbara, still only 20 years old, was maneuvered into a situation where marriage appeared to be the only socially acceptable resolution. In the 1930s, for a woman of Barbara's class, reputation was everything. A hint of scandal, an accusation of impropriety, can close doors that wealth alone cannot reopen. Her father, Franklin Laws Hutton, attempts to dissuade her from the marriage. He has Alexis investigated, discovers the family's history of marrying for money, and presents Barbara with the evidence. She ignores him. In later interviews, friends speculate about why. Some suggest she was genuinely infatuated with Alexis, who was handsome, charming, and attentive in ways her father had never been. Others suggest she was simply desperate to escape her father's control, to establish her own household, to prove that she could make her own decisions. Still others suggest she believed, despite all evidence to the contrary, that this man might actually love her. Hutton provides a $1 million dowry, and according to some accounts, an additional annual allowance. The wedding is elaborate, Russian Orthodox ceremony, reception at a grand hotel, international press coverage. Barbara wears a gown by Jean Patou and diamonds that once belonged to the Russian aristocracy. The photographs show a radiant bride and a confident groom. They do not show the financial arrangements that underpin the romance. The marriage is, by most accounts, a disaster from the beginning. Alexis spends lavishly on polo ponies, jewelry for himself, houses he has no intention of maintaining. He is, according to friends who knew them both, charming in public and cold in private. Barbara tries to make it work, tries to be the wife he wants, tries to believe that her generosity will eventually be reciprocated with affection. It is not. Within 2 years, Alexis has burned through much of the money Barbara has given him. The marriage ended in divorce in March 1935. Barbara, now 22, has learned an expensive lesson about the difference between performance and reality, between charm and character. In settlement papers later filed in Paris and New York, she continues to provide Alexis with income, not because he has any legal claim, but because she cannot quite let go of the hope that he might someday acknowledge that she was more than just a source of funds. The society columns record the glamour, the tiaras, the polo matches, the Riviera resorts, the parties where champagne flowed and music played until dawn. The legal documents tell a different story. Bank transfers, settlement negotiations, adjustments to the trust her father established to protect her fortune. In private, in a fragment of a diary entry later quoted by a reviewer of Heyman's biography, a teenage Barbara had already written, "I shall be an old maid. Nobody can ever love me. For my money, but not for me. I am doomed." The prophecy, it seems, is fulfilling itself. Yet Barbara does not become cynical, not entirely. Against all evidence, against all reason, she continues to believe in the possibility of love, of genuine connection, of finding someone who values her for something other than her bank account. This faith, naive perhaps, but also deeply human, will lead her into 6 more marriages, each one another experiment in purchasing security, another attempt to transform money into affection. In her first marriage, the etiquette she learned became contract language. The girl who wrote perfect thank you notes is now writing checks, trying to buy what she knows, somewhere deep inside, cannot be bought. By December 1935, only months after her divorce from Alexis Medivani, Barbara married Count Kurt von Haugwitz Hardenberg Reventlow in a quiet ceremony in London. Reventlow is Danish, aristocratic, and handsome in the stern Nordic manner. He presents himself as serious, responsible, different from the flashy, careless Alexis. Barbara wants to believe this is true. She wants to believe that this time she has chosen more wisely. With Reventlow, she has her only child, Lance, born in London in February 1936. Contemporary accounts describe her as devoted to the baby, more engaged and present than she has been with anything else in her life. For a brief period, motherhood offers her a role that feels genuine, necessary, uncomplicated by financial transaction. She loves Lance without reservation, without the wariness she brings to every other relationship. But the marriage quickly reveals itself to be worse than the first. Biographical accounts and court records preserved in British and American archives describe verbal and physical abuse. Reventlow is controlling, jealous, and violent. He monitors Barbara's correspondence, restricts her movements, criticizes her appearance, her friends, her attempts to maintain any independence. When she defies him, he responds with rage. The violence culminates in an incident in which Reventlow beats Barbara so severely that she is hospitalized. He is briefly jailed. Friends and family urge her to leave immediately, to file for divorce, to protect herself and Lance. She hesitates. In the 1930s, divorce carried a social stigma, particularly for women. Barbara has already been divorced once. A second divorce will mark her as damaged, unstable, a failure at the one role women of her class are expected to perform competently: wife. At Reventlow's insistence, Barbara formally renounced her American citizenship in December 1937, taking Danish nationality before a New York federal court. The decision is framed as a tax strategy. Danish citizens pay lower taxes on foreign income than Americans do, but it has far-reaching consequences. During World War II, when Denmark is occupied by Nazi Germany, Barbara's status becomes complicated, her loyalty questioned. The renunciation of citizenship, a decision made under pressure to please a husband who does not value her, will haunt her for years. The marriage finally ended in divorce in 1938. The custody battle over Lance is bitter, protracted, and expensive. Reventlow demands money, claims to be Lance's primary parent despite evidence to the contrary, uses every legal strategy available to extract as much as possible from his former wife. Letters and affidavits from the proceedings, later filed in London courts and quoted in biographies, show a woman who has been trained all her life to comply now trying, haltingly, to assert herself through legal language rather than social charm. Her handwriting, once exercised exclusively for thank you notes and polite correspondence, is now deployed in sworn statements and testimony. She describes the abuse, the fear, the damage done to her sense of self. The language is careful, precise, modulated to persuade judges rather than charm dinner guests. It is a different kind of performance, but it is still a performance, still a matter of using the tools she has been given to navigate a world where women's power is always mediated through men: fathers, husbands, lawyers, judges. Barbara wins custody of Lance, but at a cost. Reventlow retains visitation rights and continues to receive financial support from her. The legal battle leaves her exhausted, anxious, and more isolated than ever. Friends from this period describe her as increasingly withdrawn, dependent on sleeping pills and alcohol to manage the stress. The cheerful, hopeful girl who believed that wealth could somehow insulate her from harm has been replaced by a wary, wounded woman who understands that money is no protection against cruelty. In photographs from the late 1930s, Barbara appears fragile, her smile forced, her eyes guarded. She has learned, through brutal experience, that marriage for women of her class is not a romantic partnership but a form of legal and social captivity. The same discipline that taught her to sit straight, smile gracefully, and write perfect letters is now used against her in a marriage where obedience is no longer a social grace but a weapon. She has been trained her entire life to please, to comply, to subordinate her own needs and desires to the expectations of others. Now she is paying the price. In 1936, while still married to Reventlow but seeking some measure of independence and security, Barbara commissions architect Leonard Rome Guthrie to build a vast neo-Georgian mansion on a site in London's Regent's Park, on the grounds of the bomb-damaged St. Dunstan's Lodge. The house, eventually named Winfield House, after her grandfather Frank Winfield Woolworth, sits on 12 acres of gardens and lawns, the second largest private garden in London after Buckingham Palace. The project is ambitious, expensive, and deeply personal. For once, Barbara is not simply spending money on clothes or jewels or gifts for men who do not value her. She is building something permanent, something that might outlast the temporary alliances she calls marriages. The house is designed to be a sanctuary, a place where she and Lance can be safe, comfortable, protected from the scrutiny and hostility that seem to follow her everywhere. Contemporary accounts emphasize her concern for Lance's security. The Lindbergh kidnapping in 1932 has traumatized wealthy American families, making them acutely aware of the dangers that come with visible wealth. Winfield House is built with security in mind: high walls, controlled access, loyal staff. Inside, Barbara fills the rooms with old masters, Chinese wallpaper panels, and jewels that will later become legendary. She acquires a jade necklace that experts later describe as one of the finest strings of jade beads in existence. She commissions Cartier to create a tiara. She buys pearls that once belonged to Marie Antoinette, an ironic choice given the French queen's fate. Architectural plans, invoices, and photographs preserved in British archives form a record of a woman attempting, for once, to build rather than to be bought. She works with landscape designers to create gardens that are both beautiful and private, screening the house from public view. She selects furniture, fabrics, and art. She makes decisions about layout, lighting, decoration. Mundane decisions, perhaps, but for Barbara, they represent a rare form of agency. Yet even this monumental house is framed in the press as another expression of excess by the poor little rich girl. Newspapers run articles estimating the cost, mocking the extravagance, questioning why anyone needs a house so large. The criticism misses the point. Winfield House is not simply a display of wealth, it is an attempt to create stability, to build walls, literal and figurative, against a world that has repeatedly failed to protect her. In photographs of the house taken in the late 1930s before war damage requires extensive repairs, the interiors gleam with polished wood, silk draperies, and fresh flowers. The rooms are grand, but also, in their way, intimate. This is a house designed to be lived in, not just admired. It is, for a few brief years, Barbara's home in a way that no other place has been since her mother's death when she was 4 years old. For a moment, the architecture of privilege becomes literal, the only walls in her life that she has chosen herself. But history has other plans. War is coming. The house will survive, but the life Barbara imagined living there will not. On 8th of July 1942, in California, Barbara married Cary Grant, one of the most famous film stars in the world. The press, delighting in wordplay, immediately christens them Cash and Cary, a nickname that reduces their relationship to its most obvious component: her money, his fame. The marriage seems, on the surface, to follow the pattern established in her previous unions. A wealthy woman marries a charming man. Money flows from her accounts to support his lifestyle, but archival material, including Grant's own letters and biographies written after his death, complicates this narrative. Grant, though not wealthy by Barbara's standards, is financially successful in his own right. He does not ask for money. He does not drain her accounts. When they divorce in 1945, there was no alimony, no settlement, no financial entanglement. This is almost unprecedented in Barbara's marital history and suggests that whatever else the relationship was, complicated, difficult, ultimately untenable, it was not primarily a transaction. During the Second World War, Barbara returned to the United States, having regained her American citizenship. She donates her yacht to the Royal Navy for use in the war effort. She contributes funds to Free French forces and to various relief organizations. She uses her celebrity to sell war bonds, appearing at public events and rallies. Photographs from this period show her in tailored suits with military-inspired details. Less fairy tale princess, more purposeful citizen. For a brief time, war gives her a role not defined solely by romance or scandal. Correspondence with the U.S. Embassy in London, later summarized on the official Winfield House website, records that Barbara visited the house after the war and found it damaged by bombing. She stood in the ruined garden, surveyed the cracked walls and broken windows, and made a decision. She telephoned her New York lawyer and offered to give the house to the U.S. government for use as the residence of the American ambassador to the Court of St. James's. The gift is extraordinary, both in financial terms and in symbolic meaning. Winfield House, with its 12 acres in central London, is worth millions. Barbara, who has spent much of her life being criticized for extravagance and selfishness, gives it away for essentially nothing. The official transfer price is later recorded as $1. The gesture receives some positive press coverage, but not nearly as much as her debutante ball or her marriages. Generosity, it seems, is less newsworthy than scandal. For once, her signature transfers property upward, not to another husband, but to a state, a different kind of alliance, sealed not at the altar, but in a diplomatic cable. The house will serve as the ambassador's residence from 1955 onward, hosting state dinners, diplomatic receptions, and official functions. Barbara will never live there again, but in giving it away, she transforms a private sanctuary into a public asset, a monument not to her wealth, but to a rare moment of genuine generosity. By 1946, Winfield House has officially become United States government property, and Barbara has moved on to the next chapter in her long, troubled romantic history. Over the next 2 decades, she marries 5 more times, each marriage following a pattern that is by now familiar. Initial hope, public spectacle, gradual disillusionment, expensive divorce. In 1947, she married Prince Igor Trubetskoy, a Russian aristocrat and occasional race car driver. The marriage lasted 4 years and ended in divorce in 1951. Trubetskoy, like her earlier husbands, receives financial support both during and after the marriage. Contemporary accounts describe him as charming but feckless, better at spending money than earning it. In 1953, Barbara married Porfirio Rubirosa, a Dominican diplomat legendary for his athletic prowess, his romantic conquests, and his ability to extract money from wealthy wives. The marriage lasts 53 days. It is widely regarded, even at the time, as Barbara's worst decision, a moment of catastrophic judgment. Rubirosa is rumored to have received $1 million settlement and expensive gifts, including a plane and a coffee plantation in the Dominican Republic. He is Barbara's Waterloo, the husband, who makes even sympathetic observers question her sanity. In 1955, she married Baron Gottfried von Kram, a German tennis champion and, according to later biographical accounts, a homosexual man who marries her partly for financial security and partly to maintain respectability in an era when homosexuality is both illegal and socially ruinous. The marriage is reportedly unconsummated and ends in divorce in 1959. Von Kram, at least, treats her with courtesy, if not passion. Barbara later describes him as a friend, one of the few husbands she does not regret. Finally, in 1964, at age 51, Barbara married Prince Pierre Raymond Don Vinh Nha Champasak, a Vietnamese-born member of the Laotian royal family and a practicing Buddhist. This marriage, Her seventh lasted until 1966. Pierre, younger than Barbara by more than a decade, is by some accounts genuinely fond of her, but the relationship cannot survive the vast differences in age, culture, and expectation. They divorce relatively amicably, and Pierre, like von Cram, remains in contact with Barbara after the marriage ends. Contemporary commentators begin to see her as a late, almost exaggerated version of the dollar princess, a reminder that the old pattern of wealth for title persists into the mid-20th century, even as aristocratic power wanes and social norms shift. Barbara's marriages, taken together, read like a catalog of 20th century European and international aristocracy: Georgian princes, Danish counts, Russian princes, German barons, Laotian royalty. Each marriage is documented in settlement papers, legal filings, financial transfers. Each one represents another attempt to transform money into connection, to buy what she knows cannot be bought. In letters and interviews from this period, Barbara tries to define her own experience, to push back against the narrative that she is simply a foolish woman throwing money at undeserving men. "Money alone can't bring you happiness," she remarks in one widely quoted interview, "but money alone has not brought me unhappiness. It had a certain fascination for my husbands." The line is half defense, half confession, an acknowledgement that she understands the terms of her own life even if she cannot escape them. By midlife, her romantic curriculum vitae reads like a ledger: 7 names, 7 experiments in buying security and paying for it again and again. The hope that animated her first marriage, the belief that someone might love her for herself, has faded but not disappeared entirely. Even in her 50s, Barbara continues to search, to hope, to believe that the next relationship might be different. The faith is touching. It is also, by this point, tragic. In the 1950s and 1960s, Barbara's name appeared less frequently in society columns for parties and more often in fashion magazines and auction catalogs. She is a favored client of Cartier, Van Cleef and Arpels, and Balenciaga, assembling a jewelry collection that becomes legendary even in a world accustomed to extraordinary wealth. The jade necklace, 72 perfectly matched jade beads, is later described by gemologists as one of the finest strings of jaded beads in existence. Her Cartier tiara, her Marie Antoinette pearls, her diamond brooches and emerald rings are photographed, catalogued, exhibited. These objects, once worn to charm husbands and impress rivals, now circulate through auction houses and museum exhibitions. Exhibition catalogs and museum labels list Barbara as former owner, turning intimate possessions into historical artifacts. The jewels have outlasted the romances they were meant to secure. They survive as evidence of a life lived in pursuit of something: love, security, validation, that proved more elusive than any gemstone. Meanwhile, Barbara's health deteriorates. She has struggled with weight since adolescence, a struggle that intensifies into anorexia in her middle years. By the 1960s, she weighed less than 90 pounds, her body skeletal, her face gaunt. Prescription drugs, sleeping pills, tranquilizers, painkillers accumulate in her medicine cabinet. Alcohol becomes another crutch. Friends and family express concern. Stage interventions plead with her to seek help. She resists, or tries and fails, or succeeds briefly before relapsing. Interviews from this period describe a woman increasingly frail, increasingly isolated, surrounded more by staff and hangers-on than by genuine friends. The entourage that travels with her, doctors, nurses, secretaries, companions, is paid to care for her, which is not the same as caring. She knows this. Everyone knows this. But the performance continues, the machinery of wealth keeping her alive, even as life itself becomes harder to bear. In 1972, Barbara's only child, Lance Reventlow, died in a plane crash in Aspen, Colorado. He is 36 years old. Multiple biographers cite his death as emotionally catastrophic for Barbara, the loss from which she never recovers. Lance was the one relationship in her life uncomplicated by money, the one person she loved without reservation or wariness. His death removes the last tether connecting her to hope, to purpose, to any future worth imagining. After Lance's death, Barbara retreats further into addiction and isolation. The ritual of letter writing, once so central to her life, narrows to a smaller circle: lawyers, doctors, the occasional old friend. She still writes thank you notes, still maintains the forms of courtesy she learned as a child. But the handwriting is shakier now, the letters briefer, the gaps between them longer. The script has not changed, the hand executing it has. The jewels she once wore with pride are sold off gradually, piece by piece, to pay for medical care and the vast household expenses that continue even as her fortune dwindles. The jade necklace, the Cartier tiara, the Marie Antoinette pearls, all eventually go to auction or private sale. Collectors and museums acquire them, preserving them behind glass, labeling them with her name. The same jewels once deployed as bargaining chips now sit under museum lights, their provenance labels telling a story of possession that outlasted the possessor. On 11 May 1979, in Beverly Hills, California, Barbara Hutton died at age 66. The cause is listed as heart failure, though friends and biographers note that decades of anorexia, addiction, and prescription drug abuse have destroyed her health long before her heart actually stops. Financial writers, drawing on estate records and probate documents, note that the woman who inherited roughly $40 million in 1933, an amount equivalent to more than $500 million in inflation-adjusted terms, dies with approximately $3,000 in her bank account. The money has been spent, given away, stolen, squandered. She supported 7 husbands, some more deserving than others. She gave generously to friends, staff, charities, and strangers. She lived expensively, maintaining houses, yachts, wardrobes, and an entourage that would have bankrupted anyone with less to begin with. She was also, by multiple accounts, systematically cheated by financial advisors, lawyers, and hangers-on who saw her vulnerability and exploited it without remorse. Only 16 people attend her funeral at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx near her mother's grave. The number is shocking. This woman, who once hosted thousands, who was pursued by princes and photographed by the world's press, dies nearly alone. The small funeral procession is a final commentary on the difference between wealth and connection, between public glamour and private desolation. In a different archive, a letter from F. Scott Fitzgerald to his daughter, written decades earlier, offers a kind of epitaph. Fitzgerald warns his daughter that the system that produced Barbara Hutton cannot endure, that it is built on inherited wealth and social exclusion and must eventually collapse under its own contradictions. He sees Barbara not as an individual failure, but as a symptom of a failing system, a warning about what happens when money replaces love, when privilege becomes prison. Today, visitors to the National Portrait Gallery in Washington can see a mid-century portrait of Barbara, painted in 1954 when she was 41 years old. The painting shows a woman carefully composed, self-possessed, meeting the viewer's gaze with something like defiance. She wears pearls. Her hair is perfect. Her expression is controlled, revealing nothing. It is a masterclass in the performance she spent her entire life perfecting, the appearance of grace concealing whatever lies beneath. Elsewhere, in the Victoria and Albert Museum and in Cartier exhibitions around the world, her jade necklace appears under glass. Its provenance line now a single cool sentence, formerly the property of Barbara Hutton. The necklace is beautiful, flawless, and worth millions. It tells a story, but not the whole story. Not the human story of the woman who wore it. The girl who once sat at a Ritz-Carlton desk signing hundreds of thank you notes now survives as an image on a wall and a name on a museum label. A reminder that in the portrait gallery of the Gilded Age and its aftermath, Grace was often both the frame and the cage. She learned to perform privilege with perfect discipline. She never learned how to escape it. In the end, she is remembered not for who she was, but for what she represented. A fortune, a warning, a tragedy dressed in pearls. The gloves she wore that December night in 1930 are long since dust. The letters she wrote have been archived, cataloged, reduced to data. What remains is the story of a woman who had everything money could buy and almost nothing it could not.